First of all, take us into the challenges we understand it. What I've read, at least in the coverage, is it's principally a First Amendment challenge. Whose First Amendment rights are being really invoked here?
Thank you so much for having me. As you mentioned, what's really at the heart of this debate and at the heart of the debate over this law is this kind of question of free speech and First Amendment rights versus alleged national security concerns. So as you mentioned, TikTok has filed a legal challenge to the divest or ban elements that were in the foreign aid package, where it is explicitly named in that portion of the law. And part of that challenge is on the First Amendment grounds, both as it relates to the app as well as it relates to the app's users. There's also a separate challenge brought by a group of TikTok users or TikTok content creators that is about the user's speech rights separate from some of the other issues that may come up in the case involving TikTok itself.
So as far as you can tell, Jennifer, looking at what Congress did, what it said it was doing, is this a matter of concern about what the expression is on TikTok or access to the data about who's using TikTok? Because I've heard both invoked during the discussion in Congress.
It's still a bit unclear what the primary national security claim that proponents of this bill, that the government, as it's defending it in court, will seek to make. Because during the debate, there have been several different elements expressed. Some are about questions with regards to Americans' data security, which would have one set of potential solutions to weigh against a divest or ban. Others are more about TikTok's algorithm and the potential that it could be used for some form of foreign influence, or even just about the type of content that's on TikTok. And in those cases, we're getting much more to a traditional First Amendment analysis that we've seen play out before. A lot of questions about content neutrality and whether or not this is a prior restraint on the speech of the American users of TikTok.
Well, as you suggest, I mean, there are different levels of scrutiny depending on First Amendment, whether it's content neutral or not. If it's not content neutral, it's a strict scrutiny standard. Could national security trump a strict scrutiny standard?
Based on what we've seen so far, the government will have to make a really compelling case that lays out a very strong national security argument if that's to be something that it's able to overcome. When we look at the case involving the Montana ban of TikTok, which was a straight ban as opposed to a divest or ban bill, at the preliminary injunction stage, what the court found was that that particular law would not even pass intermediate scrutiny, let alone strict scrutiny. Now, that was a state level challenge as opposed to a federal law. It was a flat out ban as opposed to a divestiture ban. But that's probably the most similar case that we've seen in the court so far, which would seem to indicate that you would have a lot of skepticism and a really strong need to prove any case when weighing it against the First Amendment rights involved in this scenario.
I'm glad you raised the Montana situation. That was a state restriction, as I understand it. There was also an attempt at an executive order at the federal level. TikTok so far has done all right in these challenges. Does that track record indicate anything about how it might fare in the D.C. Circuit?
I think it indicates that we have strong First Amendment precedents when it comes to the rights of American users of this app. The fact that this would be the government potentially foreclosing a venue for speech that millions of Americans have chosen to access, when there could be less restrictive means to consider if there are national security concerns. We've seen, for example, requirements around removing TikTok from government devices or government networks, both at a state and a federal level, that have seemed to not face the same degree of legal scrutiny as something more like a ban or divestiture ban. There are also other questions around, could there be some element of disclosure or mandatory audits that would resolve some of these concerns if they are valid, short of going to a step that would have such an impact on American speech rights as something that could potentially take away this venue.
Jennifer, you're a specialist in technology policy, and I wonder what the possible ramifications could be of a decision here in the D.C. Circuit for other regulation of social media companies. I mean, for example, if the D.C. Circuit were actually to strike this down, might it limit the government's ability to have other regulations for other social media outlets?
I think there's more of a question of what happens if the D.C. Circuit upholds this. How much intervention would that allow the government to have into the social media market more generally? While the bill explicitly names TikTok, it also opens the door to the government being able to regulate other companies that may be seen as having ties to Russia, China, North Korea, or Iran. Notably, some other companies that have been brought up in this discussion include e-commerce platforms like Shein and Temu that have been incredibly popular. There are also messaging apps and video game apps that may have some degree of ties, and it's unclear what due process rights a company has or how tenuous those ties can be for the government to establish that it falls under this kind of element. So while we're seeing a broader debate around online speech, both in Congress and in the courts with things like the net choice cases also moving forward, I think the more interesting question here is how far could this law extend? How much could this allow the government to intervene into social media or app stores more generally and into American speech were it to fail in the court?